In 2017, D.B. Cooper's tie was submitted to a laboratory and they discovered hundreds of thousands of particles on the tie. What does that tell us about D.B. Cooper? Hey friends, how you doing? Eric Pulis here. All right, let's talk about D.B. Cooper's tie and specifically some of the evidence, some of the particles that were found on D.B. Cooper's tie. Okay, back in 2017, Tom Kay, who's a scientist who had access to D.B. Cooper's tie, submitted to a laboratory in Chicago called McCrone, and these guys are world class in terms of what they do. He submitted some evidence that he had pulled off D.B. Cooper's tie during some previous visits to the FBI field office in Seattle, where he had an opportunity to inspect the tie and actually pull off some of the evidence from the tie. And interestingly, what was discovered by McCrone under an electron microscope is that there are literally like over 100,000 different particles on the tie. Now, what's very fascinating about those 100,000 plus particles is they're special and unique in many ways. And what I mean by that is that some of the particles included commercially pure titanium, high grades of stainless steel, aluminum, as well as a number of other things like rare earth elements and other more common things like salt and sand and a whole variety of elements and particles and things of that nature from his tie, from D.B. Cooper's tie. Now, all of this data, all of this information is actually available to the public to see on Tom Kay's website. The McCrone and Associates report related to the analysis of the tie, specifically the particles from the tie, is on his website, Tom's website, which is citizensleuths.com. So over the last few days, I decided I have nothing better to do, so I'll just dive into 100,000 particles from D.B. Cooper's tie and see what I can learn about this thing. And it's pretty complicated and it's pretty dry and it's hard to decipher a lot of this stuff. But there are a couple of takeaways from my analysis of these particles. First of all, there's just a hell of a lot of them. There are a hell of a lot of particles, which in and of itself just kind of stands out and strikes me as a little bit odd. It's obvious to me that D.B. Cooper didn't wash that tie or didn't clean that tie often, if at all. So that's the first thing. The other thing that's really remarkable about the particles that were found on the tie is that they're really kind of specialty particles, I guess is probably the way to put it there. Again, commercially pure titanium, high-grade stainless steel, rare earth elements, things of this nature that wouldn't appear to be very obvious to collect on your tie in the 1960s or early 1970s. So one of the questions I actually had for Tom Kay in the last few days, I spoke with him on the phone a couple of times about this. I asked him, if you took a t-shirt, if you took one of my shirts or a clothing item from me today and, analyzed it to the same degree that they did these other particles, would you find those kind of particles on my clothing items? I mean, in other words, are these things just kind of all over the place and everybody kind of has them, especially if you didn't wash your particular item for an extended period of time? And Tom said, no. He said, no, these particles are really pretty special because there's obviously the sheer number is special, but the variety of particles is special. And it really helps us pinpoint where D.B. Cooper was, because that tie followed D.B. Cooper around and that tie picked up evidence, if you will, from the various places or the place that D.B. Cooper worked or spent a lot of his time. So here's the interesting thing about it. In particular, I was looking at the stainless steel. There's a couple of grades of stainless steel, 300 series and also 400 series stainless steel. And I was particularly interested in trying to determine the chemical balance of the 300 stainless steel that was found. There were like 500 pieces of 300 series stainless steel found on D.B. Cooper's tie. Now, these are very small pieces. These aren't like chunks of stainless steel. They're very small pieces, the kind of thing that you would see under an electron microscope. And I was looking for a very specific thing as part of the chemical makeup, and that is titanium. The reason why is there's a specific grade of stainless steel, 321, that's the particular series, that was common and almost exclusively used in the manufacture of jet engines. Interestingly, after looking at the 500 pieces of stainless steel and the chemical analysis, I came away with virtually none of them had any kind of titanium in there. Now, there were maybe 10 or 11 or 12 that had traces of titanium in there. The problem is it's hard to know whether or not, these 10, 11, 12 different pieces that appeared to have the titanium signature were an anomaly in some way, or if they're indicative of actually 321 stainless steel. So it is hard to determine that from that, that really small sample there. The thing that's worth considering though is that, out of the 500 pieces, there were only, like I said, a dozen or so that had titanium. The rest of them didn't. So that appeared to be more of a regular grade of stainless steel, perhaps, series 304, which is a lot more common. But Tom did bring it to my attention when I spoke with him that what makes all of this notable is that in fact, it was stainless steel. It wasn't like they just found regular steel on DB Cooper's tie or regular metals. The things that they did find were unique, and they seemed to be indicative of a specialty metals area, a specialty metals shop, and or something along those lines there. Not to mention the rare earth elements part of it, which tends to also be consistent with some sort of high-tech manufacturing type of place. So as I've looked at this and considered what does that tell us about DB Cooper, what does that tell me about DB Cooper, and specifically where this guy came from, and I assume where the guy worked, there are a couple of takeaways rather. First of all, I've been really focused on Pratt & Whitney. And the more that I looked at the particle analysis, did the deep dive, if you will, I'm not so sure Pratt & Whitney is going to work, because there is just such a broad array of particles that it just doesn't seem to be consistent with Pratt & Whitney. However, it does get me thinking that perhaps we ought to be looking a little bit further upstream. Specifically, there is one company that I've identified in Connecticut that actually was responsible for creating specialty metals and cold forming and cold pressing specialty metals and parts and things of that nature for Pratt & Whitney and for Boeing and for subcontractors of Boeing and Pratt & Whitney. So what's intriguing about this particular company is under that umbrella, or at least under that roof there, I can see that a lot of these particular types of metals, specialty metals, and other particles and elements and things of that nature that were found on DB Cooper's tie do seem to be consistent with that type of environment. So if I were to hazard a guess, I would say that DB Cooper probably came from that area, the Connecticut area, which is where Pratt & Whitney is located, and again, where this particular company is located, for a couple of reasons. And I think the salt on the tie and the sand on the tie kind of indicates that as well, because I'm of the opinion that that salt and sand on the tie is consistent with the type of salt and sand that was used on roads in cold weather places like the Northeast. And you really don't see that kind of stuff used on the roads in California, for example, which also has, a healthy aerospace sector. So Connecticut's of particular interest as far as that is concerned there. So I suspect that DB Cooper probably came from somewhere around that area and from one of these companies a little bit further upstream, because the company that I'm referencing specifically actually sourced specialty metals from different other companies around North America. So I could see DB Cooper being a guy that was responsible for sourcing these metals and these specialty particles and elements and things of that nature from a variety of customers or a variety of associate companies across North America. So perhaps DB Cooper's traveling on a regular basis to these places. Obviously, it's a business trip, so he's wearing a clip-on tie. He finds himself on a lot of floors and a lot of different areas and stuff And this would explain where some of these things, where these particles were picked up over time. And of course, there was ultimately a crash of the aerospace sector that took place in 1971. Boeing was greatly affected. Pratt & Whitney, other aerospace sector companies and subcontractors were greatly affected because that whole industry just collapsed there for a handful of years. So I could also see a situation where a guy like D.B. Cooper is all of a sudden out of a job. The guy's holding a pink slip. His prospects are dim. He doesn't really know what to do. But what he does do is he leverages his knowledge and his experience related to Boeing and the 727 and the Seattle region and things of that nature, and ultimately decides to pull this thing off. And one final thought with respect to that, which is kind of unrelated to the particles, but may well provide a measure of I guess, evidence as to why D.B. Cooper did this thing to begin with, relates to a skyjacking that took place 11 days before D.B. Cooper's skyjacking. There's a guy named Paul Sinney in Canada, up around the British Columbia and Alberta area, that attempted to skyjack a jet and extort like $1 million 11 days before. Ultimately, the guy wasn't successful, but it was a broadly reported or a widely reported event at that time. Again, 11 days before the D.B. Cooper skyjacking. And I've seen articles in the New York Times and the Seattle Times, really in all kinds of places from that time, that discuss this very first attempt on the part of somebody to actually skyjack an airliner and extort money. So I suspect that perhaps D.B. Cooper, kind of being a little bummed out and down on his luck, may have seen this, may have heard of this guy, read the New York Times or something of that nature, and this little seed was planted in his mind, and he decided, you know what, that may be my ticket out. 200 grand, there we go. I jumped from an airplane and I'm all good. So I suspect that may have something to do with it. So that's where I stand today, folks, as far as everything related to the tie and the evidence on the tie. I still think it strongly points to the New England area. I'm not so convinced anymore that specifically Pratt & Whitney, but as I look into this further, we will see if there is anything more to pick out of this, to pick out of the evidence, all those 100,000 particles on D.B. Cooper's tie. So, of course, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to shoot me an email, eric@ericulis.com. And until next time, as always, folks,